Good to see everyone this evening. We're really glad that you're here, especially grateful for any visitors we might have here at the Hillcrest Church of Christ. You're a special guest. Just to let our visitors know that we've got Sunday school every Sunday morning at 9:30. Also, our morning worship is at 10:30 on Sunday, and our midweek service is Wednesday at 7 o'clock. As I mentioned this morning, there's a couple of updates, revisions to the bulletin that I wanted to mention. And again, if you don't have a copy of the bulletin, please pick one up. Lots of information in there, updates on our hospitalization, sick list, contact information for our church leadership, and upcoming events for the adults and the youth. But to circle back to some of the updates, Harold Green has tested positive for COVID, so if we can just be mindful of Brother Harold in his situation. And also Renee Hooper's sister, Jill Perry, she came home on Friday after her triple bypass surgery, and the family really wanted to express their gratitude for all the calls and texts and prayers regarding her situation. They mentioned that to me this morning. They're very, very grateful for all the encouragement that they received. Also, as I mentioned this morning, there's a baby shower for Caitlin and Abram Pryor. That's next Sunday from 1 to 3. They're expecting a baby boy, Cohen, in September. Also next Sunday, there's going to be a diaper drop for Matthew and Deborah White. Again, that begins next Sunday the 31st, and it's going to be running through August the 28th. A table is going to be set up in the fellowship room, and again, they're going to be expecting a baby girl in September. Regarding the Lonnie Jones Spiritual Emphasis Weekend, which is coming up Friday, August the 5th through Sunday the 7th, the theme is Christianity, a Family Affair. There is a flyer in the foyer with lots of information regarding the scheduling on Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. All the meals are going to be covered except on Sunday. Fried chicken will be provided, but if we can help out with sides that go with fried chicken and also desserts, that will be a big help. If you have questions, please see Angela Doss regarding that. There's information about this in the bulletin, but I just wanted to mention the Connect Conference at Creve Hall, Church of Christ, Wednesday the 27th through Saturday morning the 30th. Again, if you want more details, that information is in the bulletin. And also regarding the Robertson and Cheatham County Foster Children's Back to School Backpack Drive, we've done a great job with that. Those items are in the table in the fellowship room over to the right. Currently, we're about 60% of our goal of 50 to get all the items that go in those backpacks. And we've got about a week and a half to accomplish that goal. So again, if you can help out in any way, those items are in the table in the fellowship room. And if you're at Walmart or a store like Walmart where you can pick some of those up, that would be greatly appreciated. That's all that I've got this evening, and now we'll begin our worship.
Well, good evening, everyone. True-hearted, wholehearted, faithful and loyal, kingdom arise by the grace we will be. Under the standard exalted and royal, strong in the strength we will battle for thee. Here at the watchword, silence and never, song of our spirit, rejoicing and free. Here at the watchword, Lord. glorious, freely surrendered and wholly thine own. Hear let the watchword silence is never, song of our spirits rejoicing and free. Hear let the watchword loyal forever, King of our lives, by thy grace we will be. We shall assemble on the mountain, we shall assemble at the throne, with humble hearts into his presence, we bring an offering of soul, glory and honor and dominion, unto the Lamb, unto the King. Oh, hallelujah, hallelujah. We sing the song of the redeemed.
Tonight's scripture reading comes from Genesis 25, verse 28. Again, that is Genesis chapter 25, verse 28. And Isaac loved Esau because he ate his game, but Rebekah loved Jacob.
Let's all pray. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you for this amazing day. That's something that you have given us, Lord. Thank you for letting us come out here to be learning more, Lord. And I thank you for keeping us all safe today, Lord. As I thank you for making your son die. As in Jesus' name we pray, amen.
Would you please stand with me? Come we that love the Lord and let our joys be known. Join in a song with sweet accord. Join in a song with sweet accord. And thus go around the throne and thus around the throne. We're marching to Zion. Beautiful, beautiful Zion. We're marching upward to Zion, the beautiful city of God. Let those refuse to sing who never knew our God, but children of the heavenly King, but children of the heavenly King, may see their joys abroad, may see their joys abroad. We're marching to Zion, beautiful, beautiful Zion. We're marching upward to Zion, the beautiful city of God. Then let our songs abound and every tear be dry. We're marching through Emmanuel's round. We're marching through Emmanuel's round to fairer worlds on high, to fairer worlds on high. We're marching to Zion, beautiful, beautiful Zion. We're marching upward to Zion, the beautiful city of God.
Well, good evening. We're glad you're with us. If you're visiting, we're thankful for your presence, and we want you to be back every time that you have the opportunity. We want to welcome those who are listening via YouTube. We're thankful you are here as well this evening, and we are glad and delighted to share this message in so many different areas, and so thankful that we can broadcast it out to the internet and people can go back at later times and look at some of the messages that we've presented. We're going to be talking about Esau, and the title of our sermon, which for whatever reason has not popped up on this slide, is, how does this birthright profit me? And I think most of us are familiar with the story of Esau and Jacob in the book of Genesis. It is a story regarding family conflict and foolish behaviors. Our reading was Genesis chapter 25 and verse 28. And it says, "And Isaac loved Esau because he ate of his game, but Rebekah loved Jacob." So we read this passage and we immediately know that there is a conflict in this family, because for whatever reason, the mom favored one child over the other and the father favored one child over the other. Now, Moses, under inspiration of the Holy Spirit, tells us that Isaac loved Esau because he ate the things that Esau killed when he was out hunting. And so we have this division, if you will, that exists in this family. And I know that people could probably sit down and do some sort of psychological study of the effects of one parent loving one child over the other versus the other parent loving the other child, but suffice it to say, this family situation was a mess. And when you read through the remainder of Genesis and you look at the dynamic that existed between Rebekah and Isaac and Esau and Jacob, you find out that the situation only becomes more convoluted and more difficult as we go through the story. And so Isaac and Jacob are divided over the love that they had for their children. Rebekah and Jacob are divided over the love that they had for their children. Going further, Rebekah was a beloved wife, but the inheritance laws were very plain about how the inheritance needed to be meted out. In Deuteronomy chapter 21 and verse 17, of course, they lived under the patriarchal laws, but this was the understanding, I believe, even in the patriarchal period. Deuteronomy 21:17, "But he shall acknowledge the son of the unloved wife as the firstborn by giving him a double portion of all that he has, for he is the beginning of his strength. The right of the firstborn is his." And so we have this understanding that given the laws of primogeniture or the laws of inheritance, that the oldest son was supposed to receive a double portion of the inheritance that would have otherwise been given to someone else. And so in the case that we're looking at, if there were only two sons, the only two sons being Esau and Jacob, it would be a situation where Esau, being the oldest under normal circumstances, would receive 2/3 of the inheritance, and Jacob would have received 1/3 of whatever it was his father had to offer. Now, of course, that would most likely change with subsequent births and subsequent situations, but nonetheless, Esau was entitled to a double portion of all that Isaac had, all that Isaac would leave behind when he left. And so it's against this backdrop that we look at the family dynamic. Esau was, in fact, the firstborn. And this is a distinctive place in the family situation of a patriarchal family, or for that matter, even in a Jewish family. In Genesis 49 and verse 3, this is what Jacob says to Reuben. "Reuben, you are my firstborn, my might and the beginning of my strength, the excellency of dignity and the excellency of power." So Jacob, even in these passages, is acknowledging that the firstborn son has a certain privilege that the other children simply do not have. And we read about how that patriarch Jacob gives out the different blessings that he bestows upon his son, and how he basically gives a double blessing to Joseph's sons, if you will, when you read through those passages in the book of Genesis. So we have a situation where Esau is the firstborn, and the accolades and the inheritance laws were all blessings that Esau had access to, yet he would casually cast them away for a few trinkets. Now think about this in a modern context. You know someone who is a millionaire, who's very wealthy, and he has a son. And you're talking with that son, and you say to him, "You know what I'll do? I will give you a happy meal for the inheritance that you are scheduled to receive from your father when he passes away." Now we know that logically, if we have common sense, we're not going to go for that. I mean, that's ridiculous. Who would do that? But for all intents and purposes, this is exactly what Esau does in the bargain that he makes with Jacob. He gives up this birthright for basically a bowl of soup. Now you think about how ridiculous that is. Some scholars have speculated that the inheritance that he would have been due would have been worth a significant amount of money. When you go back and look at Abraham and all the camels and oxen and all the different animals that he possessed, you find out that Abraham was a very, very wealthy man. And after he died, his son, who was Isaac, would have received a double portion of the inheritance, and he too would have been a very, very wealthy man. And so you carry that on down through subsequent births, different animals that may have been born into the flocks, and you find out that Esau would have been extremely wealthy if he had just inherited this birthright that was intended for him. But instead of him receiving the promise that is made through the rights of primogeniture, he decided he would give it up for a bowl of soup. And you and I sit around and we scratch our head and we think about how ridiculous this bargain truly was. Jacob is, of course, as many of us already know, the second-born son. Although Esau and Jacob were in fact twins, Esau was the firstborn from his mother. In other words, he was the first one to come out and to draw heir. Jacob was in fact a calculating and shrewd individual, very calculated and shrewd individual when you look at his business dealings, when you look at how he behaved in light of the relationship that he had with Esau. He desperately wanted the birthright that Esau despised. He desperately wanted it. And Esau was willing to give it up for nothing more than a bowl of soup. So the birthright is in fact given away. We have a record of that in Genesis 25, verses 29 through 34. Now Jacob cooked a stew, and Esau came in from the field, and he was weary, and Esau said to Jacob, "Please feed me with that same red stew, for I am weary." Therefore his name is called Edom. But Jacob said, "Sell me your birthright as of this day." Now can you imagine the kind of bargain that Jacob is suggesting in these passages? I'm willing to give you this bowl of stew, but you've got to give me a double portion of the inheritance that you are otherwise entitled to. And I can't imagine making that offering to somebody who had some sense of reasonableness about them. What made him think that Esau would be willing to accept this bargain as put forth by Jacob? You know, I wouldn't even entertain the idea of going up to somebody who is scheduled to receive a large inheritance and say, "I'll give you a happy meal for everything it is you're about to receive." They wouldn't take you up on that because they would have enough sense to know better, to know otherwise. And Esau says, "Look, I'm about to die. So what is this birthright to me?" And Jacob said, "Swear to me as of this day." So he swore to him and sold his birthright to Jacob. And Jacob gave Esau bread and stew of lentils. Then he ate and drank, arose, and went his way. Thus Esau despised his birthright. And so against all reasonableness, against all common sense, Esau sells this birthright that is unparalleled in wealth and standing to his brother for a bowl of stew. And we read this story and we think how ludicrous his thinking is in these particular situations. So what's going on here? Well, Esau's vice is the vice that many people have in our day and age, the desire for instant gratification at any cost. So many people in our world today want to experience pleasure. They don't know what it costs. They don't care what it costs, and they want it in an immediate fashion. And that's exactly what's going on with Esau in these passages. He's wanting to fulfill the needs of the flesh, and he's willing to do anything to have that fulfillment, even give up his birthright inheritance to his younger brother Jacob. People in our age are just like Esau inasmuch as they do not consider what the cost might be in that instant moment of pleasure. All they are focused on is what they can receive from that pleasurable moment, and they don't consider the entire cost of what's about to happen, the fallout from that decision. Somebody goes out and they're wanting to party, they're wanting to have a good time, and instead of them refraining from drinking alcohol, which is what should be done, they decide that they're going to go out and party and have a good time and fulfill the desires of the flesh. And then after the party's over, they get in a car and they drive down the road, And they end up maybe killing a family or an individual, or maybe killing themselves, because they could not realize that that instant moment of gratification was not worth what it would cost them or the people that they might injure in deciding to drive. Same is true about so many other situations in life, where a person is only focused on the pleasure that they can get out of a situation, and they don't care how destructive it might be to others, how destructive it is to them and their souls. They are only focused on having that moment fulfilled at the earliest possible time. And they take no thought of what the consequences of their actions might be. Many people are just like Esau because they're interested in instant gratification. So what is this birthright that we're talking about? What exactly was this all about? Why was this so important to Jacob and so unimportant to Esau? Well, I would start by saying that it was a very significant thing in the patriarchal society that Jacob and Esau lived in. The blessing and birthright were as follows. Number one, the blessing was given to the one who inherited the birthright. Number two, all the blessings ever given to any patriarch prior to Esau and Jacob were the same blessings that they would inherit. So in other words, when God talked to Abraham and said, Abraham, I'm going to make you the father of many nations, that exact same promise through the birthright was promised to Esau if he had taken the birthright seriously, and later on to Jacob because Jacob was able to purchase the birthright. So any promise that was made to Abraham or to Isaac was a promise that was also reserved for the oldest son, who would in fact have the birthright after the father passed away. The firstborn son would become the head of the family, and he would have charge of the family, including the family property. We touched on that a little bit this morning in regards to Jesus. That when Joseph passed away, Jesus, by virtue of the fact that he was the oldest, he had charge of that family. He had charge of any property that remained after the father had passed away. The firstborn son would be charged with the welfare of the younger sons, the widow, and any unmarried daughter. So he had a very significant and very important responsibility by virtue of the fact that he possessed the birthright. This son, the one who possessed the birthright, would have considerable authority over the other members of his family. As a matter of fact, I found this quote in House to House, Heart to Heart, where they're talking about the birthright, writing about it. It says, the Hebrews counted the blessing given by the father to be very important and considered it an oral contract which was just as binding as a written contract. So once this agreement is made between between Jacob and Esau, it could not be rescinded. There was no way to undo it. It was a binding obligation. It was a contract. And once it was sealed with an oath and a promise, there was no way that Esau could undo it. And we'll talk about that further in just a moment. So this birthright was very important. And Esau, if he hadn't sold it, stood to gain a fortune in inheritance from his father's estate. But we have this valuable inheritance that is just given away. It was of extreme value, and the oldest son would receive a double portion. You know how we typically divide up estates today? If you have 5 children, well then 5 children will generally get 1/5 of the estate, whatever the value is. If you have 2 children, it will be divided in half. We understand that, and that is typically how inheritance goes in our society today. But in the day that Esau and Jacob lived in, that simply was not the case. The birthright had extreme spiritual and material value. It was not just the inheritance of land like we sometimes think of. It was about the spiritual promises that had been made to Abraham by God and had also been made to Isaac by God. He would also inherit those spiritual promises in addition to the land, the possessions, the oxen, the lambs that the patriarchs possessed. There would also be a spiritual inheritance that would occur. So I would ask you this question. Would you give away your portion in an extremely valuable estate for a small meal? Would you do that? Somebody said, I'll give you a happy meal for all of the estate that you stand to acquire once your loved one passes away. Would you be willing to do that? Now that sounds ludicrous and ridiculous, but this is exactly what Esau did. He gave it all away for a bowl of stew, Hunger was one of the reasons why Esau made this particular decision. The extreme hunger that Esau felt caused him to make this irrational, rash, and foolish decision. In Genesis 25:32, and Esau said, "Look, I am about to die. So what is this birthright to me?" Now, brethren, I really believe that's an exaggeration. And I know that if you've had children, at least at one point in your life when they were younger, they have said to you, "I am starving to death." I've even said that as an adult. Now, that doesn't really mean that I'm about to starve to death. It doesn't mean that I'm a skin and bones person, and if I don't get the next meal, I'm just going to drop dead. That's not what it means at all. It just means I'm really hungry. And I think that's what's going on with Esau in these passages, that he wasn't about to drop dead from hunger. It was a deal where he was just famished because he had been out hunting and he wanted to come in and eat a meal, and I'm sure this stew smelled really good. And he was willing to do anything to have it, even though he wasn't literally starving to death. It is a misrepresentation of how things really were at that moment. Maybe a type of hyperbole where he was exaggerating the nature of his hunger to let everybody know, to let his brother Jacob know how hungry he truly was. We do that same thing in our world today, but hunger was a big part of what made him choose to sell his birthright for this bowl of stew. In the wilderness wanderings, when you look at the Israelites and the relationship that they had with Moses and God, we find out that they turned against God because of their hunger in part. In Exodus chapter 16, verses 2 through 3, then the whole congregation of the children of Israel complained against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. And the children of Israel said to them, "Oh, that we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the pots of meat, and we ate bread to the full, for you have brought us out into this wilderness to kill us, the whole assembly, with hunger." Now, did they really think that God had delivered them from Egyptian bondage just to bring them out into the wilderness so that He could allow them to starve to death? Again, it goes back to this same comment that Esau made. God wasn't about to let them starve to death. He didn't deliver them from Egyptian bondage so that they would perish in the wilderness. That was not ever going to happen. But they complained so much and couldn't see what they had, to the extent that when they became hungry, I'm sure they complained and always thought back to what it was in the land of Egypt and how they had certain meals, how they enjoyed certain meals. Now, I would question whether or not they had this abundance of food that they are referencing in these passages, because they were enslaved. And I don't mean this in a mean kind of way at all, but typically slaves don't have really good food to eat. So I've often wondered how accurate that complaint is, that they had, quote, pots of meat and bread to the fill or to the full. I really wonder if that was the case. They're complaining to God, they're complaining to Moses and say, God's brought us out in this wilderness to perish. God never intended for them to perish. But nonetheless, this hunger caused them at times to act in very foolish sorts of way, in the same way that Esau behaved. The fact of the business is, Jesus did not allow physical hunger to cloud His judgment or to give in to the temptations of Satan. We alluded to this just a little bit this morning, but in Matthew chapter 4, verses 2 through 4, Jesus is being tempted of the devil after He had been in the wilderness, and the text says that He fasted 40 days and 40 nights, and afterward He was hungered. So I guarantee you the kind of hunger that Jesus felt in these passages was nothing in comparison to what Esau felt. Esau's being much lesser degree of hunger than what the Messiah had felt at this very moment. I would about guarantee you that Esau hadn't fasted for 40 days and 40 nights. Now, I know that there's some speculation about that, but I just don't think Esau would have been the kind of man who would have said, I'm going to go without food or drink for 40 days and 40 nights. No, because he was such an impetuous individual. But we know, because the Holy Spirit tells us, that Jesus had fasted for this long period of time and that He was genuinely hungry. Now when the tempter came to him, he said, "If you are the Son of God, command that these stones become bread." But he answered and said, "It is written, man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God." That's not to say that eating something to sustain our physical bodies is not important, but it is to say that the spiritual is much weightier and much more important than the physical needs of life. And I think that's part of the problem that you find in the life of Esau and in the lives of so many people today. It is a focus on the physical rather than the spiritual. Brethren, Jesus was not about instant gratification that so many in our age are all about in their lives. I mean, in just a moment, he could have commanded that those stones be turned into bread. And he could have been instantly gratified by partaking of that bread that he had just created. Can you imagine what a loaf of bread created by the creator of the universe would taste like? You imagine how good that would be? And here he was fasting for 40 days and 40 nights, and he was genuinely hungry. But he didn't do it because he was not into instant gratification, and he certainly wasn't into giving in to the wiles of Satan, the temptations that he offered. Man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds out of the mouth of God. And so our Messiah was interested in things that had weight to them, things that mattered, rather than things that were material. But Esau, he lived for the moment. Many people have this same philosophy of living for the moment. But sadly, they are selling something more important than a bowl of soup for the moment that they are trying to enjoy, something more important than a birthright. They are selling their immortal soul so that they can enjoy that moment rather than focus on what that moment may cost them, whether it's eternal in nature or whether it's at the cost of a relationship or a friendship or a marriage. And so we have people who are selling their souls to live in the moment. I don't know if you've ever seen these buttons that say YOLO, you only live once. And I think part of the message behind that is you only live once, so you just need to go and do it, okay? Just go and do it. Just live for the moment. It doesn't matter. Don't worry about it. Don't think about it. Don't consider the consequences. And I bet Esau was probably the poster child for YOLO. You only live once. I want this bowl of soup. I'm not coming this way again. I don't care what I have to give up to have it. I want it now. So many people reason in that very same way. But you see, God calls us to steadfast faithfulness. Moses and the great champions of faith, they did not live for the moment. Look at what is said in Hebrews 11, 24 through 26. Now, I don't know if we ever think about this. I've heard some people write in a disparaging manner about Moses. But Moses lived in the court of Pharaoh as a young boy, as a young man, up until the time that he had to flee for killing the Egyptian taskmaster. And at that time, Egypt would have been a world power that would have contained most of the wealth of the world, most of the beauty in form of artistry and carvings and engravings. Most of the intelligence of that age would have existed in the land of Egypt. So Moses would have had the equivalent of a PhD education. He would have known about language. He would have been trained in warfare. He would have been trained in philosophy. Being in the court of Pharaoh and a son of Pharaoh's daughter would have afforded him every type of privilege that you and I can possibly think about. Untold wealth, untold prosperity, untold standing in the society of the Egyptians because he was a son of Pharaoh's daughter. Notice what the Hebrew writer says about Moses. By faith, Moses, when he became of age, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. When he reached an age where he realized what his lineage was, that he was in fact a Jew, he was a Hebrew, he did not allow himself to enjoy that title, being called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin. He said, I'd rather be with my Jewish brothers and sisters who are making blocks for Egyptian building projects rather than enjoy all the pleasures that might be found in Pharaoh's court. And brethren, he could have had it all. You think about this. that if he had engaged in political intrigue and maybe hid his nationality, I'm not going to tell anybody that I am a Jew because they are slaves in this land. So I'm not going to tell anybody about who I am. How many times are we tempted not to own our Christianity? Not to tell somebody that we are a Christian because we fear how we might be treated? Not going to tell anybody. That's the easiest way to get through this. There's this discussion going on, and I don't agree, but I'm not going to tell anybody who I am or what I believe because I just want to sail through. But you see,